Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the GENICODE investor presentation. Throughout this presentation, investors will be in listen-only mode. Questions are encouraged, can be submitted at any time via the Q&A tab situated on the right-hand corner of your screen. Please just simply type in your question and press send. The company may not be in a position to answer every question it receives during the meeting itself. However, the company review all questions submitted today and publish responses where it's appropriate to do so. These will be available via your Investor Meet company, and we will send you an email to notify you when they're ready for your review. I'd also like to remind you that this presentation is being recorded. Before we begin, we would like to submit the following poll, and if you would give that your kind attention, we would be most grateful. And I'd now like to hand over to Matthew Walls, CEO, and Paul Forger, CFO from GENICODE. Good morning to you both.
Good morning, Mark. How are you?
Morning, everybody.
Okay. Good morning and welcome everyone to the GENICODE inaugural presentation. So I think there's just you and I, Paul, on this call in some ways. So maybe it will take a little bit of time just to carefully go through and introduce the company. Just for those of you who are not familiar with GENICODE, we listed this morning. It's been a very busy past few months in preparation for launch. And I'm pleased to say that we're now on the stock market. So congratulations, Paul.
Well, likewise, thank you. It's been a journey, hasn't it?
Hasn't it just? I mean, the funny thing about this is that, it's against a backdrop of pandemic. So we haven't met with any of the investors face to face. We've obviously got an awful lot of other things happening as well in the world, which have made the whole thing, I think, far more complex than it would have naturally been. But we're here. So by way of an introduction, GENICODE is focused in the area of cardiovascular disease. We set up the company in September 2018, and it acquired at the time two companies from Grupo Ferrer based in Spain. So Grupo Ferrer, a large pharmaceutical company, and we acquired the GENICODE business and the GenDiag business. And the company has been developing since 2007 its technology and products. And the rest of this presentation will walk you through the history and the background and our developments over the coming, at least over the foreseeable future, next year or two. So off we go. This is the board. So some of you may be already familiar with the board, but just by way of background, so I'm Matthew Walls, CEO. I originally was with ICI, Zeneca, AstraZeneca. I used to head up commercial biotech, and in the last 10, 15 years, I've been mostly involved in taking medtech, biotech, and diagnostic companies, building them both on and off the public market. Some of them make it to the public market, generally if they're moving quickly and they have the right technology and background, and some of them grow independently off the market. So that's a little bit of background on me. If I hand over to Paul, he can give you an update as well.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. So I'll give you the shortened version. I started working in book publishing, specifically HarperCollins, which is part of News International, spent 6 years there, and then moved to Reed Elsevier, Elsevier Science, where I helped set up the London science businesses, became the finance director of those divisions, including the Lancet, spent 3 years there, moved on to set up a VC-funded digital picture library, sold out of that 2 years later. And then back in 2004, joined Hansard Group PLC, financial PR company with 35 AIM-listed clients. So I sort of cut my teeth in the AIM market, the corporate transactions. We had 35 AIM-listed clients, so got involved in more client work or with regards to corporate restructuring, several IPOs, management buyouts. And one of those corporate transactions was a company called International Brand Licensing PLC, which we turned into a cash shell. And in 2009, I was introduced to David Evans and Julian Baines, and we used that cash shell to acquire and reverse into EKF Diagnostics GmbH in Germany, with offices in Russia and Poland. And that became EKF Diagnostics PLC, where I became CFO. I left EKF in December 2015, so I spent a good 10 years at EKF. During that journey, jointly led 7 acquisitions with David and Julian in the US, Germany, and Ireland. And interestingly, the company in Ireland we acquired, Argutas Medical, was actually the root technology for Renalytics PLC, the STNFR technology for end-stage renal disease. So those some of you might be familiar with the Renalytics journey, which has been hugely successful. I left EKF 5 years ago and have been mainly working with university spin-outs, either as CFO or non-exec director, and mainly in the pharma and diagnostics arena. And I was introduced to Matthew back in October, hugely excited about GENINCODE, so joined straight away, and here we are now, 7 months later or so. So it's been a cracking journey, and delighted that we were able to list this morning. So
wonderful. No, that's really helpful, Paul, and great background. Just by way of introduction to the rest of the board, who are obviously not on the call, Geordie was the ex-CEO at FerrinCode and GenDiag, so certainly has the history and background of the company from the early days. Bill Rhodes, I met Bill back in 2011. I'd listed Epistem back in 2007-8. And Becton Dickinson at the time, where Bill was a board member, were interested in some of the technologies that we were dealing with there. So we've stayed in touch, and Bill joined us as chairman at the beginning of the year. Sergio Oliveira, one of the original seed investors who came on board. There were originally 5 of us, and that's David Evans, Sergio, Geordie, myself, and a gentleman, Nesta Oller. And then finally, David himself. So David, who I've worked with and we've known for quite some time, as Paul mentioned, he's also worked closely with him too. So we're a close-knit board. We're particularly familiar with the sector. And the rest of this presentation now will go on to explain who GENINCODE are and how we're building our company. Okay, so this is, if we jump straight in, we're a clinical genetic diagnostic company, effectively a diagnostic company, focused in the area of cardiovascular disease. What makes us different and exciting is that we're focused in the area of polygenics. So this is an area you'll see more of in the future. It's rather than a single gene or a particular mutation, which has been the dominant feature of most products over the past 10, 20 years since genetics have become more commonplace. This is looking across many genes. And to do that, it's not only a combination of identifying the genes within a sample from a patient, it's also then working through bioinformatic libraries and algorithms that allow you to risk assess and score depending on the variants and the DNA of that particular individual. So we're focused using this technology in the area of cardiovascular disease. And as I said, it's not something that's just happened in the past few years. We've been developing this technology in our products since 2007. And that was, as I said, primarily under the support then of Grupo Ferrer. We're revenue generating. So in the past few years, we've started now to build out our product portfolio and move that to market. So these are clinically applied products, mainly in Europe. We're just setting up here in the UK and also extending now into the US. Our products are CE marked, so regulatory approved here in Europe. And we've just started discussions with the FDA around regulatory positioning there too. I'll come back to that a little bit later. We've had a significant amount of investment over that period from 2007, so over 50 million euro. And we have a high amount of evidence base and studies that have supported the products as they've come through and received approval, so over 75,000. And some of the biggest clinical studies in this area for cardiovascular disease. And we undertook those studies with Kaiser Permanente in the US. We have IP protection on the core products, and we're not a single product company. We've got a small portfolio, all focused in cardiovascular disease. And why cardiovascular disease? Well, it is globally the biggest disease area. It's accountable for the highest number of deaths and mortality. It's also the most expensive disease area. And just to give you some idea, it's in mortality terms, it's about twice the size of cancer. And not only is it high in terms of mortality, but just the overall economic burden is significant. And what we bring to that is, with the advance of genetics over the last 20 years, in some ways that's been more advanced in the area of oncology and cancer. And what we're bringing now is a polygenic approach to that in the area of cardiovascular disease. Some 10 years ago, when we started first making our publications, there were only a handful of publications in the area of polygenics, and now there are hundreds. So you'll see that this is becoming quickly an area which is changing in medicine. and will be the standard of care for the future. And the area that we're most interested in is lifting that standard of care in a way that we can both better see the onset of cardiovascular disease, understand how better to treat it, and thereby manage it in terms of patient improved outcome. So that's just a quick summary of the company. If we jump to regulatory, these are the 4 products in the portfolio. We have regulatory approval on CE mark position on those 4. And of those 4, the top 3, cardio, lipid, and thrombo, are the ones we tend to focus on. They're the main growth areas for the company. GENINCODE is for onset of cardiovascular disease. Lipid for management of what we call hypercholesterolemia, that's management of cholesterol. GENINCODE is for thrombosis, blood clotting, and how that impacts an individual in terms of predisposition to blood clotting. And GENINCODE are markers for the onset of sudden cardiac death. So all of those have received regulatory approval. We've just started to unfold and take our products then into the UK. We announced just a couple of months ago with the Royal Brompton and Guy's St Thomas Hospital our first collaboration here in the UK. So that's with the largest NHS trust. And the first product that will be taken through there will be GENINCODE. Again, I'll come back to that in a bit more detail later. And then early part of next year, we see GENICODE coming on stream as well. In terms of then moving over to the US, this is the lion's share of our focus as a company over the next few years, and perhaps we expect for the future as well. And the key product that we're taking forward is GENICODE. So this is for the onset of cardiovascular disease. And then thereafter, we see the other products folding in behind that. GENICODE, interestingly, we'll come back to that a little bit later because there is perhaps an emergency use application that we can make there as well in the US. So that's the portfolio, quick regulatory overview of that and how we're set up. This is a slide that shows you how we operate. I mean, at the highest level, it's pretty simple, and it's made in some ways that even more simple by virtue of it's become almost a day-to-day occurrence in terms of what happens with COVID. So a sample is collected, it goes off to the lab, it's processed in the lab, and the results are then shared online. That's it at its simplest, highest level. But that simple high level, behind the scenes, there's a lot happening. So initially, just to go into a bit more detail, a patient will be referred to us for a test by a practicing physician. We'll then take from their sample, it could be either a sample of saliva or whole blood. From that sample, we'll then extract DNA. From that DNA that we extract, it will go through our genotyping and our sequencing libraries to identify variants that we're particularly looking for in relation to that individual. From then, it will go on into our bioinformatic libraries and AI. So there are algorithms that allow us to risk score based on the variants that we've identified. And from that, we then produce a report that is then sent online to the practicing physician. They will then go into the treatment pathway. So that's it in a little bit more detail. But to do that effectively, what you need, and this is, again, a growing feature of DNA and clinical diagnostics, is we have our own online system. It's called CITAB. And within CITAB, it not only manages the receipt of samples in, but it then risk scores and allows us to report back the details of each patient's results to the physician. So it's all done digitally, all online, and sits in the cloud in terms of the mechanisms by which we then risk score. So it's a combination of both lab work on one side, as well as then digital algorithmic assessment on the other. We produce and sell our products in 2 forms. They're done in both a service format, so that is samples sent to our labs where we process them and send them the reports back, or we can send kits to other laboratories independent of us where they can use our kits to process their own DNA and then plug into our CITAB system to get their online data and assessment of reports. So CITAB is a significant and important system for us. It's where we house all our patient information, and it's where we do all our reporting. And in this early stage, as we build, and we've got, let's say, hundreds of thousands of data points in there, but over a period, as the data points grow, this becomes a significant repository for us. So at the moment, it's in terms of managing, assessing, DNA of individuals. But as we grow over time, it also becomes significant in terms of trend analysis, particular understanding around which SNPs and variants of interest we see that are important by patient, and so on. So it becomes a much more valuable tool and asset as a company to us as we grow over time. Okay, so if we jump into a little bit more detail on what is cardiovascular disease, how is it measured in terms of a standard of care, and what will our technology do to improve it? It looks like quite a busy slide, this, but it isn't. If you focus on the top right-hand box, this is the way that cardiovascular disease is currently assessed. And when we talk about cardiovascular disease, it's often termed a lot of different things. Heart disease, heart attack gets pushed in there. Stroke is also in there, and also some other terms, things like atherosclerosis, which is perhaps one of the biggest areas of concern, and we'll turn to that and talk a little bit about that as we move forward. But the way that we assess cardiovascular disease in that top right-hand box. So is the patient or the individual, do they smoke? Do they have high blood pressure? What are their levels of cholesterol? Do they have underlying health issues? And so on. Do they take exercise? Based on your response to those questions, we then go through a risk scoring process. So the box below then starts to categorize an individual in terms of risk, whether they're at low risk of an event or whether they're at high risk of an event. And what's important in terms of cardiovascular diseases, for probably the last 20, 30 years now, it's been recognized that if you just drop to the distribution of people below, the vast majority of patients fall into what we call the low or moderate risk grouping, which in terms of classification, that's one way to look at it. But if you drop to the row below that, the vast majority of cardiovascular events are occurring from individuals who are categorized at low or moderate risk. So there's an immediate recognition that whilst individuals are classified at low or moderate risk, there's something wrong with the mechanism, the standard of care for measuring the risk of onset of cardiovascular disease. And it's not new. It's been recognized for quite some time that the current standard of care is imperfect, does need to improve. And over the period of the last 10 to 15 years, what's happened is that the growth of genetics has identified that there is the genetic load contributes around about 40 to 50% to the development of cardiovascular disease. Now, it's an important metric to understand that, because at the moment, genetics is not included in the assessment of cardiovascular disease. And partly because the technology hasn't previously been available. It needs to be done on a polygenic basis. So it's not easy to do. And the advent of polygenics is now allowing us to address it. So over the last 10, 15 years, there's been a growing weight of publications. There are many now that show that your genetics as an individual contribute around 40 to 50% to the development of cardiovascular disease. In addition to that, there's also a linear and direct relationship. So in other words, for those individuals who have a high number of variants, then there is likely to be an accelerated onset of cardiovascular disease. So this linear relationship. And what we do as a company is we combine the genetics with the classic risk factors. So we provide a comprehensive risk assessment for the onset of cardiovascular disease. That's what we do as a company. It's worthwhile, and I spent a little bit of time going through that carefully, because in essence, all our products are aligned in that same way. We bring a genetic insight alongside classic risks, and therefore provide a more comprehensive risk assessment for patients and for physicians, and thereby allowing them to move them into the right and most appropriate treatment pathway. Okay, so what in terms of applying this gives an indication of why this is a critical issue, and one that needs to be significantly addressed and as quickly as possible. If you look at, not only is it globally the world's biggest disease area by mortality, in the US alone, there are 86 million people living with cardiovascular disease. It accounts for nearly a third of all deaths per annum. And it's a significant cost to both healthcare and to the economy. And also it's growing out of control, partly growing out of control because as we live longer and life expectancy improves, it's more people living with cardiovascular disease. So the numbers are increasing. It's also increasing because of obesity, lack of physical exercise, and other things as well. But also, generally, life expectancy means that people are living longer, albeit with cardiovascular disease. So that gives an indication of where things are in the US. In the UK, it's not much different. The NHS, the 10-year strategy, has laid out a clear plan to address cardiovascular disease as a priority. And as a priority because there's a recognition in healthcare that by applying the right approach, the right diagnostics to disease areas, then we can more precisely align the right therapies to treat it. And cardiovascular disease is a really good example. We'll come back to the first product we're moving forward with the NHS in a moment. But in the case of cholesterol management, there are some really effective therapies and drugs that can be taken to address individuals, provided that we have a really clear understanding of what it is they're suffering with, the diagnosis. So as a result of that, the NHS is committed to placing this a priority in terms of healthcare, and that partly underpins why we're working with Royal Brompton, Guy's and St Thomas. They've also set up 7 genomic hubs up and down the UK, so that's the NHS investment in genetics for the future. And as I said, we're now working with the largest trust here in the UK. So it's a very exciting and valuable collaboration we have with them, and we'll be announcing more on that in the coming months as we unfold the process there. Okay, so this is another detailed slide, but it isn't if we carefully unpick it and go through it. If you just focus on the middle box there, which is 13.8%. So as I said earlier, the way that we classify patients in terms of risk of onset, risk of a cardiovascular event, is by looking at the likely, whether they have the risk of an event over the next 10 years is the way we normally classify that, or over a horizon, a life horizon. And in this box at 13.8 for this report, so this is our CardioEncode report, that 13.8 is a patient who has both their genetic risk and their classic risk factors combined. So they have a combined risk of 13.8%. Importantly, the box to the right of that, which says 5.3 moderate, if they take their current standard of care measure, the current classic risks, they would currently be categorized at a 5.3% likelihood of an event over the next 10 years. So you can see from their classic risk combined with their genetic risk, it's significantly lifted in the 13.8. And the reason for that is the box to the right, we then calculate their genetic risk factor. And if you just drop to the graph below, it's done on a distribution basis. So we map out, based on our data, our algorithms, where an individual's risk score sits. And those individuals, it's on a quintile basis. At the higher quintile level, they're at a higher risk. And in this instance, this individual has a score of 2.6, the product of which, with their classic risk of 5.3, moves them up a category from moderate risk into a higher risk band. And as a result of that, they not only move up in terms of risk, their treatment and pathway and strategy will also change. We also include in the report other information like their implied cardiovascular age, and we'll also run out a lifetime expectancy. So the report becomes a very motivational and driven report from the point of view of the physician using this together in partnership with the patient to ensure that they fully understand the risks that they face, both from a classic risk perspective as well as their genetic position as well. So that's a little bit of detail on how we operate with the CardioEncode risk score product. Okay, so in terms of clinically applying this, how would it work? How will it work and operate within the NHS or in the US? Well, most people will be familiar with their healthcare check, their health checkups on a annual or biannual or periodic basis. So at the moment, it's primarily around classic risks. So you're a smoker, what is your level of cholesterol and so on. In the future, you will have included on that a genetic risk assessment as well. And especially in the area of cardiovascular disease, given the importance that 50% of the risk is associated with your genetics, it's a key and important part that needs to be added in. So adding that in will then enable you to be reclassified. So you may well have been at a lower risk, but when we add in the genetic risk, you then maybe move up a number of categories. And as a result of that, your treatment strategy will change. And it could be from no treatment, in other words, live a healthy lifestyle, all the way through to low dose statins, higher dose statins, through to more aggressive, what we call PCSK9 inhibitors, and so on. All of these measures trying to prevent the onset of a cardiovascular event, a heart attack, a stroke, and the onset of atherosclerosis. So this is important. This is the clinical application for primary preventative care and how we'll approach that using CardioEncode as our lead product. The other point to note is on secondary prevention. So these are for individuals who've had an event. And what we've also seen from the studies that we're publishing more recently, these studies, is that the same spectrum, the same position of genetics in risk terms is consistent and continuous. So if you have a high genetic risk score and you've had an event, what we're able to also see is the likelihood, based on your genetic risk score, of whether you will have recurrent events. So we're also able to see, because of that linearity and that genetic burden and load, whether in secondary patients, in secondary preventative care, that individual is at higher risk because of their genetics too. So importantly, we're using genetics not only in primary preventative care to avoid an event, but also in secondary preventative care too. So this is the way we clinically apply what we're doing with CardioEncode. Okay, just quickly, there's some of the studies that we've undertaken in the last 10 years to underpin CardioEncode. So there are quite a number. In the early days, it was around association with linearity, so showing that the number of variants a patient had was associated with more accelerated onset. And then as you get on to settling into that process with our products, we're able to then show predictive capability. And then in 2016 and 2018, we did 2 large studies with Kaiser Permanente in the US. In 2016, it's a 50,000 patient study showing not only predictive capability for the product, but also the ability to stratify patients. So in other words, risk stratify them for appropriate treatment, and then look to see what the impact would be in terms of changing their treatment pathway. So importantly, that was in 2016 and 2018. In 2018, we did, in 16, it was European ancestry. So, and in 2018, we did Afro-Caribbean, East Asian, and Hispanic. So we have a population-based approach to the way that we're applying our product. And then more recently, in secondary prevention, identifying the variants giving rise to recurrent events. Okay, if we jump now into more of a commercial mode, so taking what we've just talked through, which is being largely clinical and product-based, and talk about what we're doing commercially, we'll start with the focus on the US, because this is our, as I said, this is the lion's share, the mainstay of what we'll be doing over the coming years. So we filed our initial breakthrough filing with the FDA. We've got ongoing discussions with them. And we expect to file our de novo filing in Q3 of this year. So in the next few months, we expect to file our de novo regulatory application. We'll likely get coding towards the end of this year. And then at the moment, the reason why we filed for breakthrough is there is a potential ruling coming. It hasn't been granted yet. So whilst it may or may not happen, we're not placing too much focus on it. But if it does happen, then we will look to apply for an opt-in to that breakthrough position in Q1 with a view to gaining regulatory approval, which is the key focus of the company midway through next year. Thereafter, we'd expect hopefully then for coverage to begin if the ruling has come through, and we'll be launching our product in the second half of next year. So this is for CardioEncode, and this is to address the market for onset of cardiovascular disease. And I'll come back to the market size and opportunity in the next few slides. Just slipping to the lower half of this slide then, what I've then laid out is this is the pathway by which we look to gain reimbursement. So it starts primarily with discussions with the Medicare, Medicaid, CMS, Center for Medicare Services in the US. Having got that position in place, so that's the Medicare, Medicaid piece, that generally acts then as a cornerstone to discussions with the commercial payers. So that's Aetna, Kaiser, Blue Cross, the other insurance providers. And through those discussions, then we'll look to gain reimbursement on a insurance provider by provider basis. That may well require us to do further clinical work with them. They tend to like to do for their populations their own in-house work, so we may well be doing work there. So we've set aside provision for that too. So that's the entry for the first product, CardioEncode, into the US. To do this effectively, and partly as a result of what's gone on with COVID, we need to have a significant group and resource in the US to properly mobilize and commercialize our products. So we toyed with the idea a year or so back of whether we would build out our own team, and COVID soon put pay to that. I mean, there still has been very little travel between here in the US, or easy travel without quarantine. So we started working just over 12 months ago with a group called Eversana Health, and a month or so back we've just announced the 7-year collaboration with them. They're an integrated commercial provider. They provide a significant coverage for marketing, selling, regulatory and pricing coverage in the US market. There are 4,000 people in the group, and they have all the expertise that we need to properly exploit our products in the US market. So we're excited by this collaboration. It's been a significant bolt-on in skills and expertise to what we're doing, and it allows us to accelerate our products now into the US market using them as our partner. And it's a very interesting partnership because it's a partnership where we have full control over the group and the team. It's a very close relationship. We've worked with them over the last 12 months on the regulatory and the marketing side to build out a strong collaborative relationship. We feel that it puts us in a strong position to significantly step on and grow what we're doing in product terms. So that's a little bit on Eversana. I'll talk about them in a moment as well. The other groups that we're working ever more closely with, and we'll be making announcements in the coming months in this, are NYP. So that's Columbia and Cornell University Hospitals in New York. They're the largest healthcare provider in the New York state, but they also cover other areas of the US as well. And IU Health in Indiana, so the Indiana Health Systems as well, we're working with them too. And they will be our flagship groups for the introduction of the products in the first phase. And then a little bit further out of the discussions with pharma too. So we've started some early stage discussions, but they'll probably engage more fully once we have our products in the market. Okay, I won't go through this in detail, but they're the work streams that we'll be undertaking in the next 12 months with Eversana. So the first half or the next 6 months is dominated by regulatory, reimbursement and coding for the product. And then the first half of next year is around preparation for launch into the US market. This is perhaps one of the most important slides, because this is the mechanism by which we've identified the target market in the US. So we talked earlier about individuals classified at low or intermediate risk. There are about 21 million patients in the US who are classified at low or intermediate risk. So these are currently just with the classic risk factors, no genetics. So as a sweet spot for our first phase of targeting with Eversana, we'll be focused on that 21 million group. And of that, we've identified through the payer systems and making contact with payers in the marketing exercise we did last year, that there are about 8.5 million of that group who, if there were a genetic product available, they would run it against their population of low and intermediate risk patients. Now, that's a significant market opportunity for us, and it's playing exactly where we see we need to be in terms of identifying within those individuals who are currently classified as low or intermediate risk, whether they've been missed, if you like, because of their genetic risk. So by bringing the genetic risk in, we're able to then either up-classify them or identify that they are correctly classified in that intermediate or low risk group. So that will be the first phase, the first wave of target market opportunity for us. The other second wave, and when we term it second wave, or I term it second wave, is the fact that we expect in the near future that the guidelines, once a product becomes available in this space, the guidelines in cardiovascular, the cardiovascular standard of care for assessment of onset of disease will change. They'll change because genetics will become part of that assessment. And at the moment, we're at the forefront of that change as a company. and we intend to stay exactly at that position. So we want to be the first to market and gain that first mover advantage with our product in the US market. And at that point, once it becomes a guideline, a recommended guideline from the American College of Cardiologists, then the market is significantly higher than the numbers here. So just so you understand, we see it in two waves. A first wave, which is the existing market and the current classic risk assessment, coupled with the genetic piece that we bring. And then thereafter, when the recommendations will then likely change. We're also in discussions with the American College as well. So that's something that we'll be staying close to and helping ensure that when those guidelines change, that hopefully we'll position our product in the right way to address that market. Okay, so just jumping quickly back to the UK, perhaps most people will be a little bit more familiar with this too. So we've set up now with the Royal Brompton Hospital, our lab. The labs at Sydney Street in Chelsea is where we will be doing, the team are going in there and we're setting up at the moment. And the first product we'll be working through for the UK and NHS is GENINCODE. I'll talk a little bit more about that as a case study in a moment, and you can see the value opportunity that presents. But it's a hub and spoke process, so the satellite groups around the UK will be feeding into Royal Brompton, and we've also got ongoing discussions with some of the other healthcare trusts as well about how we can plug in what they're doing on a broader position here in the UK. So that'll grow over the next few years as we engage that more fully with the NHS. On the EU side, so you'll recollect that we started with GENINCODE and GenDiag. So they were the two companies we acquired in September 2018 from the Spanish group of Ferrer. It's more around taking our existing products and expanding those both in Spain and across Europe. So in Spain at the moment, we're looking at piloting. So CardioEncode is now moving into regional rollout processes. So that's an exciting piece for us as we start to position the products for take up then more locally in regions. We're looking at expanding the sales teams in Italy and France. We'll certainly be taking a more collaborative approach. We've recently signed collaborations with SynLab and Longwood for Europe. And we're looking to expand the product slightly, the ThromboEncode product, by moving into oncology later next year. We've also got ongoing discussions with the German group 2, Uniclinicum in Dresden. They're the largest provider of cardiovascular testing to the German market. And again, we'll likely put in place a similar collaboration to what we have with the Royal Brompton. Okay, so just to take you through quickly, this is the case study for the NHS. So they've set out in their 10-year plan for the NHS that they want to identify 25% of the patients in the UK who suffer with what is called familial hypercholesterolemia. Familial is inherited, hypercholesterol is high levels of cholesterol. So inherited high levels of cholesterol is what we're talking about. And it's recognized that there are about 1 in 200 to 1 in 250 people in the UK who suffer with familial hypercholesterolemia. It's shortened, it's FH, a little easier to say. So 1 in 200 to 250 suffering with FH. The problem is that you need to identify them through a genetic test. And the process that the NHS has set out, it's not really where it needs to be in terms of meeting that target by 2024. And part of the reason for that is it's a highly complex test. It's very costly and it's time consuming. So what we did last year with the NHS was we ran pretty much a process with them so that they were able to assess our product. And that's what's given rise to the collaboration with the NHS. So we successfully delivered that. We'll be publishing this study in the next few months. But what it showed was that we have a more comprehensive test in this area. A faster turnaround time, a significantly faster turnaround time, which means that we can move to delivering the target for the NHS. And also at a cost that's significantly less, let's say half the price of what the cost would be to the NHS. So this is a big opportunity for the NHS to race in with a product that gives them all of the ability to meet their targets, and to do that with a clinical provider through the Royal Brompton and guys who can admirably deliver on that with us. So what we've then done is just map out that to the left-hand side, but it's a strong opportunity for us, and it's all around. The interesting thing about familial hypercholesterolemia is when you identify those individuals, you can immediately treat them effectively with therapy. But at the moment, it's like a needle in a haystack in the UK trying to identify them. So a very quick, cost-effective and comprehensive test, and we have probably the gold standard test in this area with LipidEncode to manage cholesterol more effectively. And this underpins the 10-year strategy for the NHS. So it's a product you'll see more of in the future, and it's a key one for managing cholesterol and cardiovascular disease more effectively. Okay, we've got one slide on COVID. Not that we're a COVID company, we're not, but by everything I've talked through to date on cardiovascular disease, you'll see that a lot of it is risk assessing patients for likely onset of cardiovascular disease. And we recognized early last year when COVID broke, if you remember, it was in northern Spain and Italy that had it heavily in the early days, which happens to be our main selling area, our main marketing and selling area. And we noticed quite quickly that a lot of the patients who had underlying cardiovascular issues were also the first to fall when it came to severity of onset with COVID. So we set up some proof of concept work and identified that, yes, there was an underlying link between patients who are at high risk of cardiovascular disease and thrombosis, thrombotic risk, blood clotting. So we set up a proof of concept study internally. That proved positive at the end of last year. And our first papers on this will be coming in the next few months. But what it shows is that those individuals who do have a genetic high predisposition to thrombosis, and that's the main thrust of the papers that we're looking at, are at much more severe onset and complexity of problems with infection by COVID. And this is important because as we go forward, today, historically and pretty much globally, the way that we've delivered vaccines and the next round of therapies has been based on age, which is crucially important. Of course it is. But increasingly in the future, there will need to be other risk factors taken into account. And one of them will be the genetics of the individual. So this is the way we're approaching it. We've got a lot of background because we've been both selling the product for the ThromboEncode for the past couple of years here in Europe. And as we now move to publishing in the next few months, it may well be that this becomes a fairly fast-track product coming forward in relation to COVID. So very exciting and very interesting for us on this side. So after the publications start to come through, this may well be accelerated then for an emergency use action for patients who are at higher risk of infection with COVID as a result of their predisposition to thrombosis. Okay, so this is a summary of the next 12 months. Everything that I've just talked through is now included on this 12-month profile. I won't go back through it, but it serves to show we've got a busy 12 months ahead. And also there are some significant milestones ahead of us in the next 12 months. So it's a very exciting period for the company. As a whole, we're not a big company, although we're expanding rapidly at the moment. But we're all very excited about what's happening. And also the fact that the products are now starting to be recognised for their importance in terms of risk assessment, especially the genetic risk assessment that we bring to those models. Okay, I'll hand over to Paul, and he can give you a financial update on where we are in terms of the IPO, the raise, and so on.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. So it's always a balance here, obviously. How much do you raise, when, what value, what events you've got coming up, when you'll be raising more money, etc. So we really wanted to raise enough money to get us through an 18 to 24 month period. Why that period? I think we've got we didn't want to be on the road again anytime soon. It just takes so much management effort, as many of you well know. But equally, we didn't want to raise too much at this valuation. We think this is a modest valuation, which is done at 25 million pre-money value, 42 million post. Because of those key events that Matthew's outlined in the next few months. So you can imagine that any one of those three major US events, which are breakthrough designation, de novo approval, and CardioEncode launch in the US, which we are sort of indicating is going to be July, August 2022. that's just 12 months time. So any one of those three events should have a positive effect on the company's valuation. The likelihood is here that although we've raised enough money here to get us through a 20-month period, which is what our working cap forecast suggests, we'll probably be coming back to the market in a year's time. And that would be more money to roll out new products and extra working capital for the CardioEncode product in the US, which is the main thrust of our Eversana partnership. So 17 million is a good amount. It allows us to do what we want to do, but not too much that we are overly diluting the business. So what are we going to use that for? As you'd expect, the majority of that, 11.5 million, is going to be used for Eversana. Now, just to go into a little bit more detail as to what the relationship there is, the ultimate relationship with Eversana, which is a 7-year contract, as we've disclosed in the admission document, it's to move on to a commission-based model on revenues. So in that case, they would be acting as a partnered agent, if you like. So every pound of revenue that they generate, they will earn X pence commission. And that's a great model for us and a great model for them. It incentivizes and motivates them to get up and running commercially at the earliest opportunity and to maximize those revenues as soon as possible. But in the earlier days, in order to further incentivize and motivate them, we've agreed a cost share basis. So in the earlier days, as you can imagine, it's very expensive to set up this in the US. We'll be sharing some of the expenses. So that will range between 25% and 50% of the costs. They will be picking up and deferring, and we'll be paying those back based on revenue commissions as well going forward. So basically, they've got skin in the game, and they will want to make it work as quickly as possible. So we have a highly engaging relationship with them, Matthew and I, and we're on the phone meetings with them, 3, 4, 5 times a week. So we're highly confident that relationship will be hugely successful. And let's not forget, the alternative to signing up a partner like Eversana is for us to set up our own office. Now, Matthew and I both worked for companies with US launches, and one of the biggest risks of failure is the mountainous task of setting up an office, recruiting what will inevitably be between 100 and 150 salespeople, and an infrastructure able to support what will be, in excess of $100 million revenue in 5 years' time. So it's a mammoth task. So we are very happy that we've got this relationship with them going, and that's where most of this money will be deployed. EU expansion program, so we've put aside a couple of £1 million there to roll out and expand the Spanish office. So as Matthew said, to expand the sales team, to roll out the thrombo oncology product next year, to roll out CardioEncode in Spain and Europe this year, and to deploy Italy and France and build up those areas too. So that should get Europe into a break-even position within that 2-year period, that target period that we are expecting. And likewise with the UK, we put aside 2 million, and that's to expand the Royal Brompton relationship and to roll out new products in subsequent years as well. And then we've got $1.5 million for corporate fundraise costs. So that should get us through to about early to mid 2023. So 17 million raise.
Very good. Thank you for that, Paul. So, conscious of time, just to quickly summarize, we're focused in the area of polygenics, which is coming as a technology area, and it will become a growing feature of healthcare in the coming years. And not to, just to kind of compare a little bit, cardiovascular in some ways has been the poor cousin to oncology in the last 15, 20 years, as oncology has become ever more genetic in its approach and pathway positioning, and all of the therapies now that are tending to come are focused in those particular pathways. Cardiovascular is starting to come, albeit with a more complex polygenic approach, and you'll see that as a growing feature. We provide a comprehensive assessment of cardiovascular disease, and we're looking to improve the standard of care. As you know, we have a proven CE mark we're selling in Europe, and we're now setting up our stall for US regulatory approval. We've got a significant evidence base and therefore a degree of barrier to entry for where we are. And also we've been fortunate to have great investment from Grupo Ferrer historically. We've now announced our first commercial collaboration with Eversana US to take our products to market in the US, and we'll be taking every advantage of the rulings if they come in for MSIT and so on in the future. Importantly, the way we deliver our products is really simple for the physician. They see the sample go off and they see a report come back. And what we've talked about in the presentation is a lot more of the detail behind the scenes of how we do that. And then finally, we have what we believe is a very highly experienced management team and board who are familiar with the sector, have brought companies in this way to market, and have also developed them powerfully and importantly on behalf of the investors who back us, with a view to making sure that we deliver those significant returns. Okay, just to start to finish up, this is our advisory board who are also worthy of a final mention. They are, in our view, the world's best cardiovascular clinicians. We're very fortunate that Dick Kovacs, who is just stepped down as president of the American College of Cardiologists. I've known Dick for 15 years. I sold a product company to him when he did some due diligence back in 2006 for Covance. And by good fortune, in the last few years, he took on the presidency of the American College. So he's a great advocate for what we're doing. Professor Ewan Gray, Ewan, ex-National Clinical Director of the NHS for Cardiovascular, a key contributor to what we're doing and will be going forward. Paul Casal, advises US healthcare policy on the payer side for cardiovascular medicine. John Deanfield, equally well respected here in the UK. And then finally, Ramon Bragada, who's worked with the company for the past 10 years. In the early days with Grupo Ferrer, and we do a lot of work via Girona and the labs in Spain, where Ramon is involved as well. So that's the clinical advisory team. I won't go through that, but that's simply to say that the revenues have started in Europe through Spain and our operation there. This year we expect to see the UK starting to come online, and next year in Spain, as in the US, as we then launch our first product in the US, we expect to see revenue starting to grow there. That's it. That's GENINCODE as a summary. I'm conscious of time now and the fact that we haven't taken any questions. So maybe if I hand over to whoever we hand over to.
Yeah, Matthew, Paul, thank you very much indeed for updating investors this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, please do continue to submit your questions using the Q&A tab situated on the right-hand corner of your screen. But just while the company take a few moments to review the investor questions submitted, I'd like to remind you that a recording of this presentation, along with a copy of the slides and the published Q&A, can be accessed via your Investor Meet company dashboard. I'd also like to remind you that your feedback is important to the company, and immediately after the presentation has ended, you'll be redirected for the opportunity to provide feedback in order that the company can better understand your views and expectations. Matthew, Paul, obviously investors have had the ability to submit questions. If it's okay, I'd like to hand back to you. If I could ask you to please read out the question and just give a response where it's appropriate to do so, and I'll pick up from you at the end.
Thanks, Mark. And Matthew, maybe I'll just start reading out, and between us we can
let's do that.
answer them. So Andy has an initial question. Do you see yourself developing tests away from cardio and into other specialities like mental health, for example?
I think the answer to that is we probably don't have the bandwidth to do it directly ourselves right now, but I think his point is well made, that the technology lends itself to exactly that. And it's coming as an approach, but I think the first, for us as a focus as a company for the next few years, we need to tackle the world's biggest disease area. Now, as we do that, and we expect to, and hopefully successfully do that, then yes, we can start to think about other disease areas alongside it. But let's the to-do list has got cardiovascular at the top to start with. Okay, Simon has a question. Can you talk about the costs of the tests, margins expected? Yeah, maybe I'll kickstart that. And Simon, at the moment, we're probably in the landscape of Europe of it being the most competitive market in the world. So we're starting in at the deep end, and on average, our tests sell for around €200, and the cost is probably about €100. So we're generating margins at the moment of about 50%. We've just entered the UK, where pricing is a little bit more elastic. So Matthew's been through the pricing there, so we were able to communicate that the sales
price for lipid encode test is sort of between £350 plus. At the moment we're getting more than that, but that's what we're sort of modeling, 350 to 450. And the unit cost there, we would expect the margins for those products to be higher than 50%, so more like the 60% area. And then thirdly, the third market of the US, even more elastic from a pricing perspective. So in the US, we would like to think that we can get to a pricing point of between $400 to $500. It's always a balance, because we don't want to price it so that physicians are turned off from ordering it, and to make sure that the prior authorization process in the US is as seamless as possible, so it doesn't deter the test being taken. But clearly we've got a margin to make, but that gives us enough margin space to get up to the 60, 70, 75% plus arena. So as far as we're concerned, the margins are going in the right direction over the next few years.
Yeah.
Next question from Simon. How much of the company is held by management? It's just over 30%. Management will own after admission. Andy has a second question. Can you talk about the competition in the UK market? Is it fairly concentrated or fragmented? And do you look to make acquisitions to accelerate growth?
It's the barrier to entry is quite high in this area. So whilst there are a lot of laboratories doing genotyping and sequencing, when you then start to move across into the bioinformatic algorithmic side of that, and then risk scoring, and then clinical application of that, there's a lot of obstacles to get to that point, including clinical studies where you have to prove out the product. So there isn't an awful lot of direct competition. There's a lot of early stage research in the area of groups who are moving in this direction. But I think the point is well made that, as we grow in size, we'll look to bolt on sensibly technologies that come alongside us that can add synergistically to what we're doing. So it makes a lot of sense for us to accelerate that through where there's that kind of companion link. So it's a good point. We keep our ear to the ground. We're based here in Oxford, and there's quite a lot of busy activity here, and we like to keep close to where things are. But it's taken quite a long time for us to get our products to market, as you saw from the 10-year horizon of evidence and clinical studies we've had to do, on top of the early stage research that was done in the first 5 years. So, but no, we're always on the lookout for good, exciting technologies if you know of any.
Salim has asked, in your forecasts, when do you anticipate break-even position? So Salim, I would expect in the UK probably 2 years break-even, and that's mainly because the UK also absorbs all the corporate costs from an entity perspective. So we juggle our financial modelling between geographics and also on a product-by-product basis. So UK within 2 years, Spain, which handles the European activities at the moment, I would say 18 months, and the US, which is a more medium to long term, but much bigger play, probably 5 years. So we're being realistic there. We haven't put forecast, or we haven't indicated forecasts that are going to generate tens of millions of dollars next year. We have a managed and very confident of our approach that we have, but within 5 years we would expect to see significant traction on our first product, and then once we show commercial launch and success, then we will start rolling out our new products, which will hopefully just be a year or two from now. So within 5 years, group profitability we are expecting. Charles has asked, can you down classify risk 2?
No, well, it's a good question. That you could argue that there's a case for that, but as you'd expect, we don't do that. What we tend to do is we up classify. So we look for where they've missed that ability to risk score. So if an individual has a classic risk of whatever that is, let's say 5.8%, and we see that they have a low genetic risk, we wouldn't reduce that classic risk. So it maintains at that level, and only when it gets into a higher genetic risk, then it starts to up classify. So no, it's only one way ratcheted up as up classification of risk.
Edward has asked, what do you see as the key risk to commercial success and widespread adoption?
I think that the thing that's happening, and it's happened more as a result of COVID, the whole culture and thought process around healthcare has swung back into focus. I've for the last 30 years, almost man and boy, I've worked in healthcare, and whilst it was in vogue in the early days of technology, it then soon lost a little bit of track to the communications, media, telecoms onset. And then more recently, as a result of COVID, it's come back into vogue. And as has the recognition globally by healthcare groups, US, UK, Europe, that genetics is the future in terms of recognizing and importantly aligning therapies appropriately with carefully refined diagnosis. So there's a combination of a number of things happening there that have meant that commercially, as the healthcare systems swing into recognizing that it's more and more important to get that personalized medicine, precision medicine right, then they look to the products that we have. And because what we have is quite technically difficult and there are obstacles to doing it, then there aren't that many groups you can go and talk to deliver it. And at the moment, in terms of what we're doing, we're at the forefront of the change in this area. So it's a lot of different things in answer to your question, but we do feel the time has come in commercially ramping up what we're doing as a company.
Mark has asked, why is testing not mandatory to ensure that the treatment of a patient by a doctor is based on the patient and their unique makeup? Not every patient is the same, and therefore prescriptions will not work the same on every patient.
Exactly. And you know, the thing is, historically, traditionally, if you want to go back, you know, as far as possible, pharma-based, and that's my background from AZ and Zenica before that, and ICI before that, the tradition has always been that you're trying to treat the mass population with a single therapy because that gives you the blockbuster drug you're looking for. Now, of course, that in many instances, it does work for many people within the population. But increasingly, we're getting to a point where it's running out of steam and it needs to be a more tailored, precise therapy, which has given rise to, you know, the whole rise of genetic therapies, antibodies, monoclonals, and so on, all of those things that you'll be somewhat familiar with. And you're absolutely right, coming back to your question, when it comes to diagnosis, you need a very accurate, specific diagnosis for the patient, and then the appropriate treatment that can handle and deal with that. And that is the future of where we're moving to. It's not just simply more drug in the system. It's a combination of the clear personalized medicine coupled with the right therapy.
Charles has asked, and this is the final two questions. The pricing seems very high for a high volume genotyping test, fully appreciating the value the data and analytics, etc., could potentially save the healthcare system. This implies that gross margins will be very high. Is that right? I think we've partly answered that question. I guess the other half of the answer is talking about the cost base, the unit cost. At the moment, we do our lab testing and kit manufacturing mainly in Spain. We intend to replicate that here in the UK, so we're not importing products from Spain into the new UK market. And equally, when we open up in the US, we anticipate probably initially using a pay-for-service basis at a partner lab in the US. We don't anticipate owning our own clear certified lab in the US, but we anticipate having solid partnerships with labs out there. And clearly, there are substantial economies of scale to be made in the latter years once we drive the volume up. And that'll be a combination of services and kit tests, won't it, Matthew?
It will. Yeah. And again, on that, we're still working through that and building that with Eversana around the balance of that. But we like, and I like the idea specifically of having a lot of kit capability for the US market and a plug-in process to our CITAB system so that we can exploit properly and cover the US with a kit-based. I mean, servicing through lab is obviously valuable too, but I think to properly exploit, it's good to have that kit process, and that just so that everybody's familiar. That's why we'll be working closely with the FDA on making sure they recognise the value of that kit-based process too.
Paul, Matthew, it might be a good idea for me to jump in. I think you've taken every question that's been submitted by investors this morning. So thank you to all those investors that have taken time to submit those questions. And Matthew, Paul, thank you very much for your responses. I know investor feedback is going to be particularly important to you, and we'll shortly redirect investors to provide you feedback. But perhaps, Matthew, before doing so, I could just ask you for a few comments to wrap up with.
Well, no, I thank you to everyone who's come into. This is the first presentation we've given post the IPO. We have an exciting pathway ahead of us. For those questions, the questions that have just come in have been so aligned with, and clearly people understand exactly what we're doing, which is wonderful. We often find that there perhaps isn't that full understanding of where we are and how we're approaching things. So we're grateful for that. Thank you for joining us today on the call. And we look forward to delivering, significant returns on behalf of all our investors as we move forward. So thank you for that, Mark.
Matthew, Paul, thank you once again for updating investors today. Could I please ask investors not to close this session, as we'll now automatically redirect you for the opportunity to provide your feedback in order that the management team can better understand your views and expectations. This will only take a few moments to complete, but I'm sure will be greatly valued by the company. On behalf of the management team of GENICODE, I'd like to thank you very much indeed for attending today's presentation. That now concludes today's session, and good morning to you all.